Welcome to the CMO Spotlight, and I'm really excited about this conversation today with Ami Badani, who is the brand new Chief Marketing Officer for ARM. So welcome, Ami.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to be here.
I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about the company.
Yeah, sure. So, ARM, it's sort of the best kept secret that you've never heard of. We're sort of think of us as an architectural platform. We power more than 270 billion devices from your smartphones. We're in most smartphones. We're in kind of smart devices in your home, like your thermostats, laptops, autonomous vehicles, data centers. So we're kind of think of us as like the architectural platform that provides the foundation of compute. And so I keep saying we're probably one of the most pervasive compute platforms in the world. And our value proposition is really better performance and better energy efficiency. So if you sort of look at the world today and power capped, everything is power capped. We're all thinking about energy efficiency. Everything's growing in terms of exponential compute power. And how do you actually do more with less and reduce that carbon footprint? So there's a lot of things that the company is doing, but sort of at the simplest level, it's really an architectural platform that's pervasive across every sort of compute device that you probably, use on a daily basis.
And it's a combination of hardware and software, right? There's chips, but then there's also the software that's built into those platforms, right?
That's right. I mean, ARM predominantly is a software company, and we really work with a lot of the chip companies. So they use our software and on their chips as sort of the brains of the chip, and then that gets put into phones and laptops and your data center servers and so on and so forth, your
Right.
autonomous vehicles of the future and whatnot. So yeah, think of us as like a software platform.
But talk about a very diverse set of applications and use cases for your product. It's
Right.
pervasive and it's ubiquitous.
Right. Exactly. That's right.
Excellent. All right. So I want to hear more about what you've just joined in terms of your role. Like, tell us more about your
Yep.
role. I know your last gig, most recently, you were the vice president of product, marketing and developer products for AI in the data center for NVIDIA, which is a pretty big company as well. But then you just joined ARM as the chief marketing officer. So tell me about your role and maybe even a little bit about the team that you're going to be leading.
Yeah. So I'm the chief marketing officer at ARM. The team is sort of your classic marketing team where we have product marketing, digital or demand generation, sales enablement, data analytics, data operations, PR. I'm sure I'm missing other functions, but sort of your traditional marketing team is sort of your structure. I think one of the things that sort of brought me from NVIDIA to ARM. They're close, like the companies actually partner very closely together. But I think one of the things that I noticed was, I at NVIDIA, I was sort of in the front seat of seeing the transformation of the company from, a chip company to now one of the best known companies for artificial intelligence and really having the impact to change the world. And so I sort of looked at sort of how NVIDIA transformed itself and want to bring a lot of that to ARM. And I believe ARM has the possibility to change the world. And a lot of it, the tip of the spear of that is really marketing. How can marketing really have an impact there and get people to know about ARM, have it go from invisible to visible? And so a lot of what I'm doing and what I think we'll be doing in marketing is sort of helping the company transform itself and go through that change. ARM, for folks that don't know, went public about 2 months ago. So we just started to sort of go through the growing pains of a public company. And so, with that, I'm sure folks have heard more about ARM, but we hope over the course of the next few years, it'll become, again, just ubiquitous, to your earlier point, that folks will actually know about what ARM is, what we do, the impact that we're making in the world.
Yeah, well, there definitely are some really nice examples of B2B companies that are well known by everyday people. I mean, IBM, sponsors all kinds of golf tournaments and then tennis tournaments, and
Right.
you hear about them in sports, and certainly Cisco Systems, your alma mater. I know you spent 6.5 years there, so people know Cisco Systems, and there's several others. Intel, Inside. We all heard the Intel
Right.
Inside. So it sounds like part of the plan is how do we make ARM known in the business world to people that might be, you know, engaged as customers in some other capacity.
That's right. That's right. Given artificial intelligence, again, is sort of near and dear to everyone's heart across every single device. There's a lot of things, interesting things that ARM is doing around artificial intelligence. So we want to kind of create that bridge so folks know how ARM is really, how the architecture of ARM is powering the artificial intelligence journey from now to the future. So that's sort of another thing that you'll see a lot more of in the coming months and years.
Neat. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about your career path that led you to this role, because I think you went to USC undergrad and then ended up getting your MBA at the Booth School of Business at University of Chicago. But I think
Yep.
you began your career kind of as a financial analyst, I think Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and then you ended up at Cisco Systems. So if you could just give us a really quick, like, how did you end up here? That would be
Sure.
great.
Yeah. So I sort of took, to your point, a non-traditional career path. I had, out of undergrad, I sort of had this dream. I wanted to work on Wall Street and be, in the investment banking world. So my first job out of college was really that. I worked at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. And it was, to be honest, it was probably one of the best experiences I had because it helped really ingrain myself in analytics. And I think that's so important to marketing is how can you merge the world of data and analytics with marketing. A lot of people think, okay, marketing is sort of, it's hard to measure. There are a lot of things you can measure. There are some things you can't. But fortunately, I have this deep analytical background because that's sort of where I grew up in my early days of my career. And I'm bringing a lot of that to marketing. So I sort of, did my career in finance for a number of years and then realized like I didn't wake up every morning and love looking at the stock market, the stock, when stocks moved, it didn't sort of, make me excited. So I decided to go to business school to really change my career. And at that point, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so it was a lot of exploration. I explored, courses in marketing and entrepreneurship. And I knew that intersection really excited me. So I started my first industry job at Cisco, to your point, spent a number of years there, but most recently, before I left Cisco, I started one of the IoT platform as a service business units. This is well before IoT was actually what it is today. Cisco's model is they fund startups. They give, a sort of a small pool of money. They fund these business units inside of Cisco with the general manager and a few folks to start the founding team, and then you scale. And so, that's sort of what I did for a number of years before I left Cisco, because I think at that point I said, if I really wanted to do a startup, I do it on the outside. So I went to two well-known venture-funded startups funded by Andreessen Horowitz, Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia. So tier one funded startups, and really got to kind of get my feet wet in marketing and learn kind of the world of marketing from startups, which is very different from a large company. Your kind of metrics of success are very different. And then shortly after, I was at Instart Logic, then Cumulus Networks, both infrastructure startups. Instart Logic got acquired by Akamai, which is a content delivery network company. And then I joined Cumulus Networks, which got acquired subsequently by NVIDIA. And then that's how I sort of landed at NVIDIA. At NVIDIA, I sort of did a number of different roles, both on the product side as well as on the marketing side. So I started working with one of the business units that was, one of the newer business units within NVIDIA, focused on a specific product line called the Bluefield Data Processing Unit, which was a small business, now subsequently one of the largest growing businesses at NVIDIA. And so I managed the ecosystem, which we'll talk about probably later in our conversation, and the power of the ecosystem. So any software application that wants to use this platform, the Bluefield Data Processing Unit, I was sort of involved in that integration, that solution, bringing it to market, so on and so forth. So I had to work very closely with the product team to drive those features and integration and get that product to market. And then I also worked on generative AI when, kind of when the world changed. And so I worked a lot on generative AI and specifically the data strategy for NVIDIA. So as you build these large language models, the crux of all of that is you need data, because if you don't have data, you can't train these models. So, I kind of put together a data strategy for NVIDIA. We were sort of talking to all the largest data companies in the world, from publishers to music production companies to your hyperscalers and everyone in between to figure out how can we work together on collaborating with data and helping train some of those models. And then thereafter, the ARM team approached me, and again, it was more of how can I impact the world, and how can I do that, through the lens of ARM. So I sort of, went from NVIDIA, worked very closely with the kind of on the outside looking in the ARM team, but not directly. So sort of saw the journey that the ARM team was on, and then as I kind of went through the process, it was just exciting to be on the forefront of what that company was doing. So that was sort of my journey, non-traditional, and sort of kind of honed in, got me into marketing, and now into leading a marketing team. So
well, it's moving from being an analyst, where you're kind of on the sidelines looking in, to being a practitioner. You became a practitioner. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. All right. So I'm curious if there's a piece of advice that you wish that maybe you'd gotten early in your career, or maybe you would dispense to somebody that's much younger in their marketing career or journey.
Yeah, I think, that's a good question. I was sort of, I'm thinking about it. I think there are three pieces of advice that I would probably give to folks that are starting out their career. I think one of the things that I learned probably later is be humble. Don't be afraid to say you don't know. There's going to be a lot of times in your career that you just won't have the right answers, or you haven't spent a lot of time in the space, or it's a completely different experience than what you've been used to. So it's okay to raise your hand and say, I don't know, and sort of, together think about how you can solve a problem. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is relationships really carry you forward. So build bridges versus burn bridges. And so I have, throughout my career, I think to this date, most of my, post my early days in my career, most of my subsequent experiences have been through relationships, heard about me through someone, knows me directly because I used to work with them or for them. And so I've just been fortunate about having great people, great mentors, and building good relationships. And I think that's really super important that people underestimate. And third, I think is, like I said, I had a non-traditional background. I came from sort of this analytical background, and it's been serving me really well, because if you look at marketing, I think, there a lot of money goes into marketing. And I think if you can build confidence with finance, the finance team, which, typically holds the purse strings to budgets, and kind of bring them along on the journey around marketing, and show them the confidence that, hey, marketing is doing the right things, spending efficiently in the right ways. And you do that by just sort of, partnering with them and kind of being part of an extended part of the finance team. Mm-hmm. So, that's what I've done in pretty much every career since my post investment banking days, is partnering really well with finance to sort of show that confidence. And so those are kind of the three, I guess, 2 or 3 pieces of advice I'd give to folks, looking at marketing careers early on.
That's awesome. So I do believe that everybody has a superpower. And so I'm curious what you feel your superpower is.
Yeah, I think 2 things about my superpower. One is technical curiosity. So, I'm always asking the why. So, the first sort of 3 weeks that I've been at ARM, I've spent probably the most amount of time, probably 90% of my day, understanding the technology. I feel like to be a good marketer, you have to understand the technology. Now, I'll never go head to head with an engineer, but I have to be able to meet them where they're at and like really understand the technology. And then I can figure out, okay, how can I, what is the value proposition? What's the way to tell the story? But until you understand the technology at a sufficiently deep level, it's really hard to do that as a marketing leader. So I think one of my superpowers is that technical curiosity. I'm always asking the why and the how, and trying to get into the technical weeds, and then being able to elevate that into a story. So I think that's sort of one of my superpowers. I think the other one is back to my earlier point about relationships. Building relationships, I think, has served me well. And so, building relationships, I think, is just another superpower that I have. That's just innate in my kind of personality and just my style.
Great. Well, also, I think I could even take your first superpower and broaden it to just say, get to know your product really well. I mean, in this case, yours is a technology product. And so your curiosity is focused on the technology. But if you were selling something less technical in nature, it's just how do you understand the product really well so that you can draw out its benefits so that then you can tell that story that you talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, typically marketing is not necessarily marketing the here and now. It's marketing 1 year, ahead of where you
Mhm.
want to be. So you have to sort of have the sort of the wherewithal to understand where the market is going, where the company will be best positioned in that market, understand the product, and then kind of put all those components together to really help drive the kind of the storyline for the company.
Yep. And I've seen that even in the ARM messaging, because, for example, I see even in your boilerplate at the bottom of a press release, it talks about AI, which has
Right.
exploded, as we all know. And so AI couldn't exist without ARM, right? Like you all
Exactly.
enable AI to exist in many cases. And
Right.
so it's a good example
Right.
of really understanding the zeitgeist of what's happening in the world and how
Right.
does your product enable that and fit in. So I love that.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just ask you, as a leader, I'm sure you want to demonstrate certain, um, attributes or values, and I'm sure you may even demand certain values of the people that are on your team. So, what are the values that are important to you as a leader?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. One is be empathetic. So, everyone has circumstances, experiences, everyone, has their personal life, their professional life. So, empathy is something that I strongly value and part of kind of building the team. Be humble, as I talked about earlier. I think the best ideas come from everywhere. So, inside the organization, at all levels of the organization, outside of the organization, outside of the company, the best ideas come from everywhere. So, embrace that. Really be kind of opportunistic. Look for those ideas. And shepherd those, figure out if how they could really help the organization. I think another part of what I look for in values that demonstrate a leader is breaking down silos. So I talk a lot about this across the team is overshare, break down the silos. I notice that a lot where people sort of are in their own island. And I think that causes distress and kind of a lot of conflicts. So I look for leaders that can really break down those silos and help with collaboration, communication. And then I also look for leaders that can hire for culture. So I'm a strong
Mm,
believer, and I've gone through my own growing pains of this where you hire for experience over culture and it never works out. So I always look for, folks that can really be culture builders and empower the organization because I think culture is so important. When you can get two teams that work really well together, you're just a high functioning team. And so I have this mantra that I use often, which is I build teams that have low drama, high productivity. And
mm.
so that's sort of characteristics I look for in people, in teams, in leaders, and really it's something that I hold the team, accountable for. Hire for low drama, high productivity, and all will be well.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's a great interview question you can ask that will help you understand if this person is a low drama person or a high drama person?
Yeah, that's interesting. So this will be, I was interviewing some folks last week, and one of the questions I asked is, tell me about a time where you had a difficult experience, and I think that's like a very typical interview question. But what
Yeah.
you can glean from that is important. So someone that was interviewing for a position said, I had conflict with another person in some other organization that was of, her same level, and it's not the fact that people have conflict is fine. It's the way you handle that.
Right,
And so
right.
the way she handled it is we just agreed to disagree and moved on. And I was like, well, that's not the right answer. I mean, to me, it just kind of smelled a little bit like, okay, this could be, high drama, high
Right.
drama situation. And so I think it's more about how you handle these
Yeah.
situations. And some people are, let me build the bridge. Let me figure out how we can get
Yeah.
along.
Right.
We'll have
Right.
different perspectives, but at the end of the day, we need to come together and work well together. That would have been a much better answer than, well, we're just going to, agree to disagree. We're not
Yeah.
going to like each
Right.
other. We're going to move forward. So I
Right.
think there are
Right.
just things that you can tease apart to figure that out. Sometimes you don't always get it right, but you live and
Yeah.
learn.
That's great. That's great. I mean, at the end of the day, you want the relationship to trump the specific issue, or the
Right.
specific challenge that you're facing.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm at here at Setup, we're marketing matchmakers, and that often means we connect brands. Really, what we do is we help brands figure out what their perfect ecosystem of internal resources and external resources are. And often that means helping pair them with agencies that can help fill gaps in either capacity or capability.
Yeah.
So we're not an agency, we're not on the client side, we live in that space in between, and we think a lot about that relationship between brands and agencies. And so, granted, given that you're brand new in the role at ARM, you probably don't have a lot of experience yet working with agencies at ARM, but you may have done that in your previous roles. I'm just curious, generally, how do you like to work with marketing agencies? Where do you see their role in supporting your organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of times what I look for agencies is how can they give the team lift? And so, how can they be sort of an extended team member or agency for the team to give them lift? And so, I obviously there are lots of agencies, but areas that I look for are, and lift is one thing in terms of, you know, just an extra pair of hands. But I think also equally important is expertise. So, it's an area like brand where, an agency may have lots of experience with companies that want to transform themselves and go from invisible to visible, as I talked about earlier. And we may not have the skill sets within the team because we haven't gone on that journey. We have lots of great ideas, but someone who's sort of been there, done that, and can kind of help us think about what that looks like, I think is complementary. So we look at, where there are gaps and where an agency can help fill those gaps based on experience they have, or, an extra pair of hands if we're just short staffed. So I sort of look at agencies really in those two areas.
We call that in my business, we just say there's either capacity issues or there are capability issues. Like, capacity is we don't have enough arms and legs. Capability is there's an external expertise that we just don't want to own in-house, or we don't have in-house. And so that leads me to the next question is, are there certain disciplines of marketing or certain areas where you feel you could really benefit to get the outside perspective or expertise? And are there certain other disciplines or areas where you really feel like we need to own this in our team and we would never seek outside support? Never is a strong word, but generally not seek outside support.
Yeah, and I've actually been part of organizations that rotated one way where we had agencies in every single discipline within marketing. And then at NVIDIA, the company believes strongly in, if it's an important function, it should be done in-house. So that company almost has zero agency support. Never say zero, but probably not as much. And so it kind of, in my worldview, I think there's a balance. And so there are certain disciplines like I said, for us specifically, brand, probably an area where, we probably need some help thinking about what our brand strategy is. That's one that I would think is, to your point, capabilities that we need to sort of think about from an agency perspective. Others, PR is a lot about relationships with reporters. And so those are capabilities that we may or may not have in-house. And so, that's an area where we can, certainly think about using an agency. We use agencies today within that function and within brand. So, probably figuring out what's that sweet spot look like. To your point, the arms and legs, for us, digital media and really helping us optimize our digital media. I know we use agencies there today, so we're sort of looking at, does it make sense to bring that in-house? Things that I feel strongly about that should be kept in-house are things that are just very hard to supplement with an agency, because you need to know the core of the business really well. Right. Product marketing is very hard to outsource to an agency because you just need to understand the product. Positioning is so important. You got to understand where the company is going. So that's very hard to outsource to agencies. I've had agencies do content marketing, but I feel like that more and more is being brought in-house, depending on the company and whether it's a technical content or non-technical content. It's just hard to do that when you don't know the domain of the business, and people within the company just will always know the domain of the business better than agencies. It's just a fact. And so those are functions that I prefer to keep in-house versus staff up with an agency.
Yeah, well, and I think it also depends a lot on the competencies within your team and the capabilities within your team.
That's right.
Because when I say we help clients and brands think through their ecosystems, every single marketing ecosystem what nirvana looks like for your marketing ecosystem is very, very different from a different kind of company or different sorts of,
Right.
depending on the team, depending on your industry, depending on your preferences and all of those things. And so it's
Right.
great to come in and figure out, as somebody new with fresh eyes, you can look at the team, look at the ecosystem and say, is it the best? Like, do we have the right agencies? Do we have the right people to do the things we really
Right.
want to do? And the answer may be yes across the board, or there may be a gap somewhere where you're like, hey, I need to fix that or change that or
Right. 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 Exactly.
exciting. So, all right, as marketers, we often work with non-marketing functions within the organization, although often they all think that they're marketers, even if they're not. And you
Right.
mentioned earlier, for example, partnering really closely with finance when you're at NVIDIA. Um, I'm curious, how do you demonstrate the value of marketing to those non-marketing functions?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. There's kind of shades of gray. I think there are some, like, with some marketing disciplines, it's very black and white. And then in some marketing disciplines, it's shades of gray.
Yeah,
And so, like, brand is something that's very hard to measure. I mean, there's lots of
right,
metrics around brand, but it's not very black and white. Whereas pipeline generation, how much revenue is marketing actually bringing into the company? That, there's lots of tools you can kind of map the journey
yeah,
and figure out marketing's influence on pipeline or revenue ultimately. And I think there you sort of have to figure out how do you walk that fine line. And there are things that I look at, like pipeline generation, share of voice, web traffic, conversions across channels. I'm sure a lot of marketing leaders look at a lot of those metrics, but kind of digging in deeper and having kind of a gut feel. A lot of it is also gut feel around, is this working? Is this not working? But you can measure a lot of it with all the tools that are available today. So I think I've realized there are certain functions where like engineers have a very hard time sitting in that shade of gray. They're like, what do you mean you can't measure brands? Because
right,
that's just kind of how they've grown up. And
right,
so you sort of have to bring them along on that, why it's very hard to measure certain disciplines of marketing. Finance is
right,
probably very similar, but I think, some like HR probably understands that you can't measure, brand or some of these intangibles within marketing. So I think you just have to kind of bring it all together and kind of educate people that there are places that you can measure marketing, there are places you can't, but you can get close to understanding all these different data metrics and then kind of put together the large picture. And you may not be exactly precise, but if you can get 80% of the way there, I think that's sort of a win.
yeah. Well, I was going to ask you to estimate what percentage of your time you needed to spend educating the team on things like that. But I guess that's also very dependent on the organization and also the
Right.
relationship. Like, as you're building new relationships at
Right.
ARM, you'll build trust and you'll build communication
Exactly.
with the team to be able to, you know, use shorthand to explain things, or not have to
Exactly.
build as big of a business case to do something because now you've gotten yourself enough, leash to be able to try something new or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
So I'm curious if there's a specific campaign or a program or something that you were a part of in your past that taught you something really valuable because either it was a flop and you learned something you really needed to learn, or it was really successful and it's something you'd like to emulate again in the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's as much of a campaign as it is a philosophy. And I think I
Okay.
learned this at NVIDIA, and I think NVIDIA does it phenomenally well, which is use the ecosystem to your advantage. And if you look at the way NVIDIA goes to market, it's all through their ecosystem. I mean, you have every partner in the world talking about NVIDIA. That any artificial intelligence partner right now that's doing anything around that space is talking about NVIDIA. And so they don't go out and market themselves, but they talk about themselves as a platform, as an enabler, and how they can help their partners be successful. And I think that's super powerful because then you don't have to do all this direct marketing because your partners are telling your story for you. And so I've realized that through my experience, most recently at NVIDIA, that is just very, very powerful. So for ARM, given that we are ubiquitous and pervasive across so many different platforms. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. There's a lot we can do with the ecosystem to get leverage and demonstrate how XYZ company is using ARM in their day to day, and showing that story. And I think having partners tell that story for us is way more powerful than ARM telling that story on its own.
Right.
So it's really a philosophy around how can we get leverage from the ecosystem to help tell the ARM story.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to wrap things up with a couple of kind of quick hitting, fun questions that aren't necessarily marketing questions. The first is there a quote or a book or a movie or a band or a sports team that really inspires you, and what is it about that inspires you most?
Yeah, I think probably the two really books that I would say that inspire me are Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah,
and then there's another book that's probably less heard of, which is Gang Leader for a Day. And both of those books, what I like is there's always context. Outliers, it's all about context, understanding context. And so generally when people come to me with issues, I'm always like, please give me context, because there's always a rhyme or reason why something was done, and there's always context. I think with Gang Leader for a Day, it's basically a book about the gangs in the south side of Chicago, and someone going undercover, this University of Chicago student going undercover and into sort of some of the worst gangs at the time, and living in someone else's shoes, walking in someone else's shoes. And it kind of gives you perspective and so you learn about all the dynamics around why these gangs exist, and the structural issues, and why it's so hard to enter. I mean, why it's easy to enter, hard to leave, and the financial structure. And it's just super fascinating. And just a book about, again, walking in someone else's shoes. There's always context, and there's always, outliers. And so it's just sort of those two books are always kind of go top of mind for me in terms of inspiration. They're not your typical business books, but they're just, kind of deep philosophical books about kind of life, and really help you put perspective in your own certain circumstances and experiences.
Yeah. Well, you talked earlier about, deep empathy is something that's extremely important to marketing, to understand your customer and put yourself in their shoes and feel the pains that they're feeling and helping solve their problems. So, hey, I mean, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is crucial as a marketer. And so I can understand it's not a marketing book, but it kind of is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so two more quick ones. One is there a brand that you have never worked on that you really admire, and what is it that you admire most about that brand?
Yeah, I'll answer with two. One that's probably, I'm sure, an answer that comes up very frequently, which is Apple. I mean, I think it's one of the most loved brands in the world, and that's, it's pervasive, it's consistent. I mean, you know what you're going to get when you get an Apple device, whether it's your phone, your AirPods, your Mac, whatever it is. I mean, it's just consistent, and the user experience is consistent, and they've really evolved and transformed from what they used to be in the late 90s to now what they are today. So it's just been remarkable to see Apple through the decades of change. I think the other one is Louis Vuitton, only because they've been able to create a premium brand and really create this niche audience of people with just their brand. I mean, if you look at LV and you kind of stamp that logo onto anything, it's like automatically puts you in this premium category. So it's sort of diamonds in the rough is kind of the best way to think about it. So I think they've done a remarkable job of sort of carving out a niche, a premium niche, and really kind of staying true to who they are. If you kind of go to the shopping malls and you look at all these luxury brands, LV is like the one with the lines out the door. So they've really created and cultivated a following. So those are probably two brands that I just admire.
And and Louis Vuitton is aspirational for many people too, but not unattainable.
That's right.
Which is an interesting balance. It's an interesting balance to be aspirational, but not there are millions and millions of people who have liked the Porsche Facebook page or follow them on Instagram, but never have and will never own a Porsche. Whereas if you really want to own a Louis Vuitton item, you probably could at some point if you really work. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So last one is outside of your family, which is an easy, obvious thing. I'm just curious where you find joy outside of work. Do you have any hobbies or things that you love? What do you do when you're not at work, free time wise?
Yeah. So I've found a newfound love for pickleball, which has now become, kind of a sport that's on the up and up. And so I do, a lot of pickleball, on the weekends with my family. Without my family, there's a pickleball league that is part of this club that I belong to. I've also recently discovered a newfound passion for hip hop. So I am part of this adult hip hop class that, it
You mean
just gets me
dance, hip
outside of
hop
the
dance?
hip hop dance. Yes,
Okay.
yes. And so, we learn these dances and then we perform every so often. And so it's just great to kind of take my mind off of work and have another purpose in life. So those are kind of just two fun things that I, have just recently discovered. More of a ongoing passion is traveling. So, myself and my family, we're sort of, we have the travel bug. So every time my kids get a break within school, it's like, well, what interesting country can we explore? We're sort of explorers by nature. So our next trip, I think, this April coming up, we're planning on going to Iceland to see the Northern Lights because in
Yeah.
2024, it's the brightest it will be
Oh,
in, I
wow.
don't know, several decades. So anyways, I sort of been on my bucket list and that's we'll be kind of bundled up. It will be 20 degrees, but it'll be fine. And hopefully we'll get to see the Northern Lights. So
Awesome.
anyways, that's
Awesome.
a
Well,
little bit about
you should
myself.
have never told us about the hip hop dancing because now we'll have to include a little clip of
I
you dancing
know.
in the video. No, but anyway, so Ami Badani is the Chief Marketing Officer of ARM. Ami, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.